covers the muscular system. So we're going to look at muscles from the cellular level all the way up to the organ level, looking at individual muscles in our body, like the pectoralis major or maybe the quadricep muscle of the leg. There are about 600 skeletal muscles in our human bodies. Remember, the skeletal muscles are the ones that we have conscious control over. All muscles in our body constitute about half of our body weight. There are 3 types of muscles: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And all 3 of these types are specialized for one purpose: to convert the chemical energy in ATP, as well as the electrical energy coming from an action potential in the nervous system, into mechanical energy of muscle contraction and thus motion. Myology is the study of the muscular system. Anything that has the prefix myo in it is going to involve muscles. Also, sarco is another one that's going to involve muscles. Remember from lecture that the muscular system functions for movement, stability, control of openings and passageways, as well as heat production. We do not have a model showing the whole muscle with the connective tissues of the muscle, but you are responsible for knowing the connective tissues and how a muscle is organized. So in this picture, we have a tendon connecting the muscle to the femur bone in this case. Around the outside of the entire muscle and continuous with the tendon is a connective tissue sheath that's called the epimysium. Inside the epimysium, you start seeing lots of structures made up of multiple muscle cells bound together. These structures are called fascicles. So this fascicle has lots of muscle cells wrapped up in it. Around that fascicle is called the perimysium. And inside the fascicle are the multiple muscle fibers. If you were to pull one out, wrapped around the muscle fiber is the endomysium. And even further inside the muscle cell or the muscle fiber are a whole bunch of myofibrils, which are made up of sarcomeres, the individual contractile unit of the muscle. So again, the endomysium is the connective tissue that surrounds each muscle fiber. Remember that a muscle fiber is another term for a muscle cell. The endomysium allows room for capillaries and nerve fibers to reach each muscle cell. The perimysium is a slightly thicker layer that wraps around the fascicles, and then the epimysium is the fibrous sheath that wraps around the entire muscle. The epimysium is what is continuous and grades into the fascia. The fascia is connective tissue that separates neighboring muscles and is continuous with the tendons or ligaments. Looking at a slide of the connective tissue in the muscle. So over here you have a longitudinal section of the muscle. So this here is one cell, one muscle cell. This is another muscle cell. Notice that you can see the striations inside the cell. And this is a cross section of the cell. So if you were to cut these cells here and look at it, it would look like this. So you can see the orientation of the muscle cells. Each one of these is a single muscle cell. Wrapped around that muscle cell or muscle fiber is the endomysium. And then you've got a whole bunch of muscle cells in a fascicle, and wrapped around that fascicle is this fibrous perimysium. We talked about the myofibrils and the myofilaments in the myofibrils in the lecture PowerPoint, so I'm not going to talk about those again, but there is a model of the sarcomere inside the myofibril and all of the myofilaments that might turn up on the lab final. So I'm going to go over the parts of this model, and the physiology of the model you will have to refer to the lecture PowerPoint for. But looking here, up here we have the entire sarcomere going from Z disc to Z disc, and this is the functional contractile unit of the muscle. If we zoom in, we can see the different myofilaments of the sarcomere. The red string of pearls that is twisted, that is part of your thin myofilament made up of actin. The yellow string that wraps around the actin is the tropomyosin. Remember, the tropomyosin is what blocks the binding site between actin and myosin. The green little globules, or I don't know, upside down ice cream cones, whatever they are, those are troponin. Those are what help the tropomyosin block the actin binding sites. When troponin has calcium bound to it, it changes shape and thus pushes the tropomyosin out of the way. But in its normal resting state, the troponin and the tropomyosin block binding between actin and myosin. So actin, troponin, and tropomyosin are all part of the thin myofilament in the sarcomere. The blue filament over here, this myofilament, is myosin. It is the thick myofilament, and it has these characteristic golf club heads that spiral around the myosin proteins, and the golf club heads are what's going to actually bind with actin during muscular contraction. So these are the players in the sarcomere. You have the thin myofilaments and the thick myofilaments. This model does not show the elastin myofilaments, so you do not have to be able to identify it for the lab final. So here we have the whole model of the sarcomere, again going Z-disc to Z-disc. And you are responsible for being able to identify the myofilaments, so the thin ones made up of actin, tropomyosin, and troponin, as well as the thick ones. You are also responsible for being able to identify other structures in the sarcomere. So the sarcomere runs Z-disc to Z-disc, and the Z-disc is what the thin myofilaments are anchored to. In the middle of the two Z-discs is a structure called the M line, and these are what the thick myofilaments are anchored to. There are also regions of the sarcomere that you must know and be able to identify as well. Knowing them for the lab is good, but they can also come up on the lecture final as well as exam 5. The region centered around the M line, where there is only thick myofilaments present, is known as the H band. So from here to here is the H band. When you were looking at it on a slide, it stains in the medium level of grayness. The other two bands we'll talk about are either lighter or darker than the H band. So the H band is in the middle, and you have the M line, M for middle, right in the middle of the H band. The region where you have the thick and thin myofilaments overlap from one end to the other, so thick and thin overlap here, all the way to thick and thin overlap here. So where that starts to where it ends, that is called the A band. The A band stains more darkly because you have this overlap here. There's a lot less space between the myofilaments. So it stains more darkly. Dark has the letter A in it. That's how I remember it. The A stands for anisotropic, but you just need to know it as the A band. And again, that goes from where the thick and thin myofilaments overlap to where they stop overlapping. Notice that the A band includes the H band in the middle of it. The region where there is only thin myofilaments is going to be the I band. So here, where there is only the red thin myofilaments, you have the I band. These stain lighter because they are thinner and have more open space, extra fibril space in between them. And so they stain lighter. Light has an I in it. The I band is lighter. So when the muscle contracts, the Z-discs move towards each other. So they move towards each other, shortening the entire length of the sarcomere and shortening the length of the I band, because as they shorten, the thick myofilaments start overlapping the I band more and more. So the A band stays the same length, but the I band shrinks, or it gets smaller. Here we are looking at an individual muscle fiber or a muscle cell. You can tell that it is a muscle cell and not an individual muscle because of the structures. So you can see very clearly mitochondria. They look like little kidney beans with lines across them. You have a nucleus. So the entire muscle isn't going to have one giant nucleus, so this makes it a single cell. You have a nucleus, and you also have the neuromuscular junction here, where you have the neuron coming to innervate the muscle cell. So this is a Schwann cell wrapped around an axon, and the neuromuscular junction with the junctional folds is seen here. You can also see individual myofibrils with the myofilaments inside of them. You can see the striations here, and so the darker striation band is going to be your A band, the lighter one is going to be your I band, and from the middle of one I band to the middle of the next, remember Z disc to Z disc is a sarcomere. Looking at the cross section of the top of the cell, you have the myofibrils, completely filling the muscle cell just about, and the myofibrils are made up of those thick and thin myofilaments. And then looking at the structures around the myofibrils, you have the blue T-tubules, which are used to pass the action potential throughout the cell faster. You have the tan-colored sarcoplasmic reticulum. And remember, where those sarcoplasmic reticulum ends get wider, they are called terminal cisternae. Two terminal cisternae sandwiching a T-tubule together makes a triad. So you have the triad labeled down here. Remember that each muscle cell is wrapped in the endomysium. So this here could be part of the endomysium. Over here, you have the late lavender colored endomysium, and then the actual sarcolemma is the peach colored underneath it. So the fascicle orientation of the muscle organs, so looking at muscles as an organ now, different muscles have different orientations of those fascicles, or different orientations of the muscle cells inside the fascicles. This can result in different shapes and different looks, and it can also partly determine the strength of a muscle and the direction of its pull. So you have fusiform shaped fascicles or shaped muscles where you have a tendon on either end causing a thinning of the muscle, tapering at the ends. The bicep brachii is going to be an example of a fusiform muscle, as well as a couple of the quadricep muscles. So the quadricep is made up of 4 different muscles, and a couple of them are fusiform as well. Parallel muscles are where the fascicles are all oriented parallel to one another in straight lines. The rectus abdominis, your six-pack muscle, is a parallel muscle. Triangular muscles are where it tapers at one end but fans out. So the pectoralis major is one of those. A unipennate muscle is going to have a tendon that runs up one side of it and it fans out almost like half of a feather. The palmar interosseous muscle, which is going to be the meat of your thumb muscle. If you were to flip your hand over and press into the meat of your thumb in your palm, that is the palmar interosseous. The rectus femoris, which is the frontmost part of your quadricep muscle, is actually a bipennate muscle, which looks like a feather. You have a tendon running through the middle of it, and the fascicles are oriented off either side of it. Multipennate muscles are where you have lots of those feathers coming off of them, and the deltoid sitting on the top of your shoulder is a multipennate muscle. This gives it the ability to pull in varying directions, which is good because it's on our shoulder, which can move in varying directions. Lastly, you have circular muscles. These are going to be all of your sphincters, like the orbicularis oculi, the orbicularis ori for your mouth, the duodenum in your stomach. All of those are circular muscles. There are 2 methods of muscle attachment. You can have indirect or direct attachment to a bone. Indirect attachment is where there is an accessory structure, a tendon, bridging the gap between the muscle ends and the bony attachment. In a tendon, the collagen fibers of the endo, peri, and epimysiums are continuous through the end of the muscle and actually blend into the connective tissue of the tendon. The tendon then bridges the gap to the bone, and the connective tissue of the tendon becomes continuous and grades into the periosteum of the bone. So this allows for a very strong structural continuity from the muscle to the bone. It's not three separate parts, it's one blended together part from periosteum to tendon to the endoperi and epimysiums of the muscle. There's also a direct or fleshy attachment to bone. This is where there's little separation between the muscle and the bone, and it looks like the muscle comes directly out from the bone. You can see this in a couple of the heads of the tricep brachii along the posterior side of your arm, as well as some parts of the brachialis, which is part of the flexor. It's one of the flexors of your elbow. So it sits beneath your bicep muscle. It is important to note that some skeletal muscles do not insert on bone, but in the dermis of the skin. So a lot of our facial muscles insert on our skin, so we can allow for eyebrow movement or the cheeks moving up when we smile. When I say insertion, that is the point where a muscle attaches to the mobile end of something. So in the case of your facial muscles, your muscles are inserting on the backs of your eyebrows, and the eyebrows are what move. It is the mobile end of the muscle. The opposite of the insertion is going to be the origin. This is the bony attachment of the stationary end of the muscle. So when you think of a muscle contracting, one end has to be stationary. Otherwise, the muscle would just shorten up and there would be no usable movement. So in the case of, we'll say the tricep muscle here, when you use your tricep muscle, you are extending your elbow. So the tricep muscle's origin is up on the scapula and its insertion is down on the ulna. So the ulna is what moves and the scapula holds the tricep stable, holds it stationary. Otherwise the scapula would just come towards the ulna and we wouldn't get the extension of our elbow. We would just get our elbow being pulled towards our scapula, which is a useless movement. So the origin is the bony attachment at the stationary end of the muscle, and the insertion is the attachment at the mobile end of the muscle. We have functional groups of muscles based on the action that you are trying to produce. So an action is the effect that's produced by a muscle. You can produce a movement, or you can also use muscles to prevent movement. The prime mover, otherwise known as the agonist, is the muscle that produces most of the force during a joint action. So for example, the extension of your knee, like when you are kicking a soccer ball, the prime mover or agonist is your quadricep muscle. That is what's doing the most force during your knee extension. The synergist is a muscle that aids the prime mover. It can do this by stabilizing a nearby joint or by modifying the direction of a movement. So the quadricep is made up of 4 different heads. In knee extension, the rectus femoris is going to be the prime mover, and another head, the vastus medius, is going to be a synergist that helps shift the direction of the movement one way or the other. It doesn't pull the most force, but it does help the overall action. And then you have an antagonist. This opposes the prime mover, and the agonist must relax in order for the prime mover to cause an action, and it will also do the opposite action. Antagonists prevent excessive movement and injury, and every action has what's called an antagonist pair, where you have muscles that act on the opposite sides of a joint, creating one action and then the opposite action. So in the case of the extension of the knee, the quadricep is the prime mover of the extension, and the hamstring is going to be the antagonist. The hamstring is what causes flexion of the knee. So in order for the quadricep to cause knee extension, the hamstring must relax. The last functional group is going to be called the fixator, and this is muscles that prevent movements of bones. You see lots of fixators in the hips and the shoulders to prevent movement of the coxal bone and the scapula so that you can have effective actions produced by muscle contractions. So looking at an example of this, when you are looking at elbow flexion, so doing like a bicep curl, the prime mover is actually the brachialis muscle, not the bicep muscle. So the brachialis muscle is here, and this is what creates the most tension flexing your elbow. A synergist, or a helpful muscle for elbow flexion, is the bicep brachii. So this also helps and stabilizes the movement. And then the antagonist, the one that must relax for this action to occur, is the tricep muscle. Lastly, the fixator, which is a muscle that holds the scapula firmly in place, is called a rhomboid muscles. There's a whole group of them. And they hold your scapula still, so when you flex, it holds the scapula stationary for the muscle to contract against. Rhomboids aren't in this figure, but they're typically found here along the back. So now we'll look at actual muscles, starting with those that are acting on the head. All the muscles that act on your head originate in the vertebral column, the thoracic cage, or the pectoral girdle, which is the scapula and the clavicle. They insert on the cranial bones because the cranial bones are what's going to be doing the moving. Actions include flexion, extension, lateral flexion, and rotation. Some muscles can cause contralateral movement, where the muscle's on the right side but causes movement of the head to the left. Some can cause ipsilateral movement, where muscles on the right side cause movement of the head to the right. Neck flexors include the sternocleidomastoid, which is a muscle that attaches to the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process of the temporal bone. You also have the scalenes as a neck flexor. Then you have neck extensors like the trapezius, the splenius capitis, and the semispinalis capitis. So here are the models we have for the neck and facial muscles. We looked at the head movers so far, that's what we've talked about. So you have the flexors. On this side you have the sternocleidomastoid. Notice that it is connected to the mastoid process of the temporal bone, then the clavicle, and the sternum. You also have a sheet-like muscle called the platysma. So this platysma is a sheet muscle that sits on top of the sternocleidomastoid, and it actually crawls up the underside of the jaw up to by your mouth almost, and so it does a little bit of neck flexion as well as some movement of the lips. The sternocleidomastoid is a neck flexor. It is a contralateral neck flexor. It brings the head down, but it also, if the sternocleidomastoid on your right side contracts, it also tilts the head a little bit to the left when it flexes. Other muscles you can see in this model, you have the scalenes muscles here, which are neck flexors, and on the back of the neck you can see the trapezius muscle, and that is a neck extensor. In the labs, pretty much every lab, but in the muscle and the bone labs in particular, you have these tables above the figures that you need. Picture the tables like a word bank. These are the muscles that you're going to be identifying in the figures, but these are also the ones you are responsible for the lab final. In the muscle lab in particular, not only are you responsible for being able to identify muscles, but you also need to know what they do. So a question could be with a model, a picture of the model saying, what muscle is this? And then the second question could be, what does it do? The action questions are always going to be multiple choice. So you might not have to know exactly elevate mandible for the case of the masseter, but you do need to be able to pick it out of a choice of 4 or 5. Moving on to our facial muscles. The ones that are responsible for facial expression are going to be muscles that insert in the dermis and subcutaneous tissues, and so that is what's going to move when those muscles contract. These muscles tense the skin and produce facial expressions. Paralysis can cause the face to sag somewhat, and they can be found in the scalp, the forehead, around the eyes, nose, and mouth, and also in the neck. Some muscles that you need to be able to identify are going to be the frontalis muscle, which is just over the frontal bone. You have the orbicularis oculi, which is the sphincter muscle around your eye. The zygomaticus, there are 2 branches for the zygomaticus. There's an inferior and a superior, but you only have to know them both as the zygomaticus. Notice that it goes right over the zygomatic bone. We already talked about the sheet platysma. You have the orbicularis oris, which is the circular sphincter muscle around your mouth. You also need to know the buccinator, which fits underneath, it's cut and it's underneath the masseter. The masseter is this large muscle here that is used for chewing. On the model, you have the frontalis muscle, the orbicularis oculi, the orbicularis oris. You have the zygomaticus muscle here, as well as the buccinator here. The buccinator is used for suckling. The masseter has been cut on this side of the face, but I will show you in a different model. Here's just a figure showing you those different muscles of the temporalis, the masseter, the sternocleidomastoid, the buccinator, orbicularis oris, orbicularis oculi, the frontalis that has been cut a little bit, and the zygomaticus sitting right over that zygomatic bone. So here you can see the buccal muscles a lot more easily. You've got the buccinator, the two branches of the zygomaticus, and the masseter. Remember, the masseter is going to be your chewing muscle. It's pretty clear how that would help with chewing. Other muscles you can still see in here, you've got the orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oris, the frontalis muscle. You can also see the temporalis muscle, the muscle that sits just over your temporal bone. You can see the sternocleidomastoid that we already talked about, and the trapezius. Now we're going to move on to the muscles of the torso and the trunk. There are three functional groups of these muscles: the muscles for respiration and breathing, muscles that support the abdominal wall and the pelvic floor, and then muscles that aid in the movement of the vertebral column. We'll start with respiration first. Breathing requires the use of muscles that enclose and wrap around the thoracic cavity. You've got the diaphragm, internal and external intercostals, and the innermost intercostal muscles as well. Inspiration is the act of air intake during breathing, and expiration is the expelling of air and breathing out. There are other muscles of the chest and abdomen that can contribute to breathing, especially as breathing becomes more labored. But for this class, just stick to the intercostals and the diaphragm. The prime mover of inspiration is going to be the diaphragm muscle. This is a muscular dome between the thoracic and abdominal cavities. What we're seeing over here is an inferior view. So if you took a transverse cut of a person between their thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities and then looked up towards their thoracic cavity, this is going to be the diaphragm. It's a sheet muscle that fits around the inside of the rib cage. You can kind of see the ribs here. The muscle fascicles are connected to a central fibrous tendon, which is this white region. And contraction flattens the diaphragm, which causes a negative vacuum inside the thoracic cavity and physically pulls air into the lungs. During relaxation, the diaphragm relaxes clearly, and this causes the diaphragm to rise back into the thoracic cavity. So if the red is a rib cage, then the diaphragm is the yellow. When it is relaxed, it's as shown, kind of curved upwards, and then during contraction, it flattens down and creates a vacuum to bring air into the lungs. External intercostals are found just deep to the ribs, but are the most superficial of the respiration muscles. They elevate the ribs and expand the thoracic cavity, so this also aids in inspiration. Internal intercostals, which are found deep to the external intercostals, depress and bring the rib cage back in, which compresses the thoracic cavity and causes the expelling of air. So here you can see the external intercostals, and then the internal ones lie deep to the external ones. So in this model, it's really hard to see, but you can see the start of the external intercostals here. They're covered by several other muscles in this model. they're harder to identify, and we don't really have good models for this one. So hint, hint, wink, wink, probably won't show up on the final. Looking at the muscles on the abdominal wall, there are 4 pairs of sheet-like muscles. You have internal and external obliques, a transverse abdominis, and a rectus abdominis. All of these serve to strengthen the abdominal wall, partially support the vertebral column, and hold our viscera inside of us. The external abdominal obliques are the most superficial of the lateral abdominal muscles. They support the abdominal viscera against the pull of gravity, and they also stabilize the vertebral column, particularly during heavy lifting. The external obliques maintain posture, they hold the abdominal organs in and compress them, and they can also aid in forced expiration. So if you are running for the first time, or if you haven't gone sprinting in a while and you do a sprint, the next day odds are your external abdominal obliques will be sore because they aid in expiration. The external abdominal obliques also aid in rotation at the waist, which is what you probably typically think of, and that's how you work out your obliques, is by doing hip twists or candlestick dippers where you do lateral flexion from one side to the other. So they aid in rotation at the waist, stabilizing the vertebral column, and compressing abdominal organs. In these models, the external abdominal obliques look very similar to the internal abdominal obliques. It's sometimes hard to tell when they are cut, like in this figure. Like here you can clearly see that they're cut. The models, it's not quite as evident. So I always tell my students to look at the orientation of the fascicles. So the external abdominal obliques make a V in their fascicles. So you've got a V going up the abdominal region, kind of like that V line that you see in super fit individuals down towards their inguinal area. So you have those lines. So the external ones make a V. The internal abdominal obliques are the intermediate layer of the lateral abdominal muscles. They are just deep to the external abdominal oblique muscles, and they also aid in rotation of the torso. So as I mentioned, the external abdominal obliques make a V. The internal ones make an A. So you can see how they're not so much on this side because it's been cut. But over here, you can see the fascicles are oriented differently than the external abdominal obliques. So keep that in mind when you are looking at the models and when you are taking the final. The deepest muscle is the transverse abdominal, and the fascicles run straight up horizontal. So they have horizontal fibers, and so again, that's the way to identify it, is by looking at the fibers. So you have external abdominal obliques, internal abdominal obliques, and then transverse abdominal. Takes practice, but noticing the fascicle orientation will help you ID these muscles quickly and with relative ease. The transverse abdominal compresses the abdominal contents and contributes to the movement of the vertebral column. The transverse abdominal is what is very good at supporting your vertebral column, and when these muscles weaken, it tends to be the transverse abdominal weakening muscle that can result in herniated and slipped discs. The last abdominal muscle is the rectus abdominal. It flexes the lumbar region of the vertebral column. It's what you use when you are doing a sit-up or a crunch. And it is going to be your six-pack ab muscle. It extends from the sternum all the way to the pubis bone. And you have what's called a rectus sheath, which in all of these figures is this white structure here. It encloses the muscle. It is an aponeurosis, technically, which makes it a sheet-like tendon. And in that rectus sheath, you also have 3 tendinous intersections, which is what gives you those lines of your six-pack. So all of this They are tendon-like, made of dense, regular connective tissue. So you have an aponeurosis rectus sheath over the whole rectus abdominis, and then you've got tendinous intersections across that rectus abdominis. The rectus sheath serves to further provide structure and provide support to compress the viscera, and then the tendinous intersections allow you to flex the spine to varying degrees. So it allows you to do a partial sit-up, a crunch, all the way sit-up. The tendinous intersections provide varying degrees of how far you want to flex your spine. So here we have the rectus sheath that I just talked about. This white structure here, the rectus sheath is an aponeurosis. It is a sheet-like tendon with the tendinous intersections traversing across the rectus abdominis. That's what this muscle is here. So you have the rectus abdominis. Looking at the fascicle orientation, you should notice that this makes a V over here. So that's going to be your external abdominal oblique. Over here, they move the opposite way. So that is your internal abdominal oblique. And we cannot see the transverse abdominis here because it is deep to the oblique muscles and those haven't been cut. Moving on to the back muscles in our torso, all of these muscles function to extend, rotate, and laterally flex the vertebral column. They can be used for posture and vertebral support. They can also be used for upper limb movement. And the big ones that we are going to focus on are going to be the trapezius, which goes up your neck, but also to the thoracic vertebra. You have your deltoid can be classified as part of your back muscles, your latissimus dorsi. You have erector spinae muscles, which are deep and run parallel to the vertebral column all the way up your spine. And you have the rotator cuff muscles, which we'll talk about in more detail later. So this looks almost exactly like the figure on the previous slide. You have the trapezius muscle. You've got the latissimus dorsi. This is the muscle that you are using when you have a pull-down bar and you are pulling that pull-down bar down behind your neck. That is looking at your lats or your latissimus dorsi. You have the erector spinae muscles. You can see it here and here, but it is a muscle that runs the entire length of the spine. And then you have your rotator cuff muscles, your deltoid muscle over here, and your rotator cuff muscles. You can see them here just deep to the trap as well. Here's a closer up picture. I will try not to draw all over this one, but you've got the trapezius muscle. You have the latissimus dorsi muscle here. You have the erector spinae muscle. You can see it running parallel to the vertebral column here and here. Then you've got the rotator cuff muscles here, and we'll talk about those more later. And those are the back muscles that you need to know for this lab, for this class. Make sure that you can identify them on the models, and you also know what their function is, what they serve to do, what their action is. Now we're going to move on to the shoulder. These shoulder muscles tend to originate on the axial skeleton and insert on the clavicle and the scapula. So remember, the scapula is loosely attached to the thoracic cage. It's capable of great movements, rotation, elevation, depression. When you're moving your arm all around, if you think about your shoulder blade and what it is doing, it has a great range of motion. The clavicle, on the other hand, your collarbone, braces the shoulder and moderates these movements. So when you're moving your shoulder all around, notice that the clavicle does not move nearly as much. Looking at the pectoral muscles on the anterior side, you have the pectoralis major, the pectoralis minor, and the serratus anterior. So the pectoralis major is going to be your pec muscle. I'm sure everybody can identify that one. The pectoralis minor is found deep to that muscle and is seen here. The serratus anterior is found on the anterior side of the rib cage but travels to the posterior side and to the scapula, and you can see them on the back sides of the ribs here. Moving on to the arm, there are 9 muscles that cross the shoulder joint and act on the arm and cause the humerus to move. 2 of these are considered axial muscles because they originate on the axial skeleton. The pectoralis major, which we just pointed out, it originates on the sternum, and it flexes, adducts, and medially rotates the humerus. So it brings the arm up, it immediately rotates it, and it can also adduct it and bring it down as well. The other one is the latissimus dorsi, which is on our posterior side. It originates on the vertebral column, and it adducts and medially rotates the humerus as well. So looking at these pectoral girdle muscles, you have the pectoralis major. This flexes and adducts the arms. So it brings the arm forward, but it can also bring the arm down in a jumping jack. You've got the pectoralis minor, which is here, and it pulls the scapula forward. So you can see how it is attached to the acromion of the scapula. It can pull it forward. You have the deltoid, which is not technically in your chest region, but it is a pectoral girdle muscle. The deltoid extends and abducts the arm. So when you are doing one of those arm raises, that is working your deltoid muscle. You can also see some structures we've already talked about. So you've got the rectus sheath of the abdominis muscle, a semitendinous intersection. You've got the top part of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And you can also see the serratus anterior just here on the outsides of all of the ribs. Then there are muscles that act on the humerus but originate on the appendicular skeleton. There are some that originate on the scapula. So this is the deltoid and the teres major. So the deltoid is that muscle that sits on the top of our shoulder, right on the top of our arm. And then the teres major is on the posterior side, and it originates on the scapula and attaches to the humerus. The deltoid rotates and abducts arm, and it's also where you get all of your vaccinations and injections. The teres major aids in extension and medial rotation of the humerus. This brings us to our rotator cuff muscles. Tendons from the 4 scapular muscles form the rotator cuff. That's what makes them rotator cuff muscles, even though some other muscles might partake in the rotator cuff. These are the muscles that have the tendons that form a lot of the structure and stability of the rotator cuff. There are 4, and they form the acronym SITS: supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. 3 of these muscles are named for where they are, and I'll go into that when we look at a picture of them. But the tendons of these muscles merge with the joint capsule of the shoulder as they cross it, moving to the humerus. This is what holds the humerus in place in that glenoid cavity. And the supraspinatus tendon is the most easily damaged because it is going to be the most superior of the 4 tendons. So it's the first one you come across when you hit your shoulder. So here is a terrible angled figure, but it allows you to see all 4 muscles at once. So we are looking at a frontal section, sagittal section of the scapula. So you've got the coracoid process, the acromion, the clavicle making up the pectoral girdle, and the border of the scapula. So the 4 muscles are the supraspinatus. Supra means above or superior, to the spinatus, the spine. So you have the spine of the scapula here. Supraspinatus sits above it. Then you've got the infraspinatus. Infra or inferior means below. So it's the muscle that's just below the spine of the scapula. And then the teres minor is the one that isn't named for its location. So it just sits beneath the infraspinatus along the lateral border of the scapula. The 4th muscle is the subscapularis. It is on the anterior side of the scapula, and it sits in the fossa of the scapula. So here's a posterior angle of our scapula, we're going to look at the 3 posterior rotator cuff muscles. So you've got the supraspinatus, which sits just superior to the spine of the scapula. Then you have the infraspinatus, which sits just inferior to the spine. Then you have the teres minor, which sits immediately inferior to the infraspinatus. Beneath the teres minor is the teres major, which is not a rotator cuff muscle, but it is on the scapula. So what makes it a rotator cuff muscle is these 3, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. All of them have tendons that go into the rotator cuff and help stabilize the rotator cuff of the shoulder. So supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor are 3 of the 4 rotator cuff muscles. They are going to be the 3 posterior muscles. Here's a model looking at just the scapula and the muscles on the scapula. So you have the posterior side here and the anterior side on the right. You can tell this is the posterior side because you can see the spine of the scapula. And so the 4 rotator cuff muscles are the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, and the teres minor, which is this one, and then the last one is going to be on the anterior side of the scapula, and it is this subscapularis. So the subscapularis sits on the anterior side of the scapula, and you cannot see it from most models because you have to flip the scapula around so where you can see the anterior side of it. So moving further down the arm, there are 4 muscles you need to be able to identify on an arm model. The bicep brachii. Bicep is not good enough because there is a bicep brachii and a bicep femoris, so you must be specific and call it the bicep brachii. You also need the tricep brachii, the brachioradialis, and the brachialis. So on this model, you can see the subscapularis. This is the anterior side of the scapula here. You can see kind of the side of the deltoid over the top of the muscle. And then you can see the bicep brachii. The brachioradialis muscle, this is going to be the meat of your forearm muscle on your thumb side. So if you feel your forearm up the thumb side by your elbow, that meat, the biggest muscle there on the thumb side of your forearm is your brachioradialis muscle. Brachio for the brachial part of the arm, which is your humerus, radialis for your radius muscle. And on the back of the arm, you've got the tricep brachialis muscle. The tricep serves to extend the elbow. The bicep brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis muscle, all of those, the other 3 serve to flex the elbow. The brachialis muscle sort of sits underneath and behind the bicep brachii, so we'll look at that on the next slide. Moving on along to the muscles that act on the hip and the lower limb, this is where you're going to find the largest muscles in the body because they are constantly having to carry our body weight around. These muscles tend to be less for precision, more for strength, and then several of these muscles can cross and act on 2 or more joints. So looking at the hip muscles first, starting with the anterior side of the body, you have the iliacus, which is part of the iliopsoas muscle. So the iliacus is the part that arises from the iliac crest and the fossa of the coxal bone. But this part combined with the muscle that connects to the vertebra all make up the iliopsoas muscle. And it flexes the thigh at the hip. So it is what brings your knees up when you're doing high knees during exercise. You also have the piriformis muscle, which goes from the sacrum to the greater trochanter of the femur. This muscle, when it is tight, can cause sciatica pain. So sometimes it's easy to alleviate sciatica pain by just stretching out your piriformis muscle, which you can do at your desk just by crossing one leg over the other. And so if your left ankle is on top of your right knee, then you fold forward at the waist, trying to put your left shoulder on your left ankle. Moving to muscles that act on the leg and the knee, on the front side of the body, on the anterior side, you've got the quadricep femoris muscle, which is made up of 4 heads. That's where you get quad. Quadricep is made up of 4 heads on the femur. This is going to be the prime mover of knee extension. It's also the most powerful muscle in the body. For this class, you must be able to identify all 4 heads, the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, vastus medius or medialis, and vastus intermedius. All 4 of these heads converge on a single quadricep patellar tendon on the distal end of the femur. This tendon extends to the patella and then continues past the patella as the patellar ligament, where it attaches to the tibia. You can also see the sartorius and the gracilis muscles on the anterior side of the leg. The sartorius is the longest muscle in the body. It's known as the Taylor's muscle. It is a muscle that goes from the lateral side of the femur and then crosses medially and attaches to the medial side of the knee. So looking at these muscles here, you have the sartorius muscles, this long one here. The gracilis is just going to be your inner thigh muscle. And then the quadricep are these large muscles here. There are 4 heads to the quadricep. The rectus femoris is the one that's found right in the middle and on top. Then you have the vastus lateralis on the lateral side of the leg, the vastus medialis on the medial side of the leg. And if you were to cut the rectus femoris, beneath the rectus femoris is going to be the vastus intermedius. All 4 of these heads of the quadricep meet for one tendon that then encompasses the patella and moves on to the patellar ligament. You must be able to identify all 4 of these heads as well as the sartorius and the gracilis muscle. Looking at the muscles on the femoral region on an actual model, you can see the sartorius muscle here, the longest muscle in the body, known as the Taylor's muscle. It is what helps us cross our legs. You can also see the 3 anterior most heads of the quadricep muscle. You have the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, and the rectus femoris right in the middle. Remember, all 4 heads of the quadricep help to extend the knee. You can also see the gracilis muscle right on the inner thigh. And if you were to cut the rectus femoris muscle and peel it back, you would see the vastus intermedius muscle directly underneath it. There's one other muscle that is mentioned in your lab, and that is going to be the tensor fasciae latae, which sits just on top of your hip. It is this muscle over here. You can see it here and here. It forms the muscular end on the proximal end. It forms muscle, and then it becomes part of your IT band or your iliotibial band. But that is going to be your tensor fasciae latae, which helps flex the thigh. Now we're going to look at the posterior side of our femoral region. This is what contains our hamstring muscle. Our hamstring also has 3 different parts that you must be able to identify. Going from the outside of the leg to the inside, you have the bicep femoris, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. So here, you can see the gluteus medius. This is a muscle that sits in the fossa of the posterior side of your coxal bone, and you have to cut through the gluteus maximus to see it. You can also see the gracilis on the inside of the thigh here. And looking at the 3 heads of your hamstring, you have the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and the bicep femoris. All 3 of those make up your hamstring, which helps to flex your knee. So here you can start to see the hamstring bifurcate into its 3 heads, but I wanted to focus on the gluteal region first. You have the gluteus maximus If you were to cut through that, you would be able to see the gluteus medius as well as the gluteus minimus. And then you can also see part of that tensor fasciae latae on the side as well. Beneath those muscles, you can see the three heads of the hamstring. You have the bicep femoris, the semitendinosus, and if you cut through the semitendinosus, you will see the semimembranosus. It tends to set a little bit deep to the semitendinosus. So that's what this left leg is showing. It's showing the semitendinosus cut, so you can visualize the semimembranosus better. So those are the three heads of the hamstring muscle, and all of them serve to flex the knee. The way I remember them is bicep femoris is always on the outside. The semimembranosus has an M in it, semimembranosus, so M is going to be on the medial side. Going down to the crural part of the leg, your shin region, there are a couple muscles that you need to be able to identify. On the anterior side, there's just one, which is super nice. It is the tibialis anterior. It's your shin muscle. So when you flex your toes or dorsiflex your toes, you can feel your muscle right on top of your shin contract. That is your tibialis anterior muscle. Here is where it is on a model. Then on the posterior side of your leg, you have a superficial group and then a deeper group. The gastrocnemius, or the butt of the calf, is going to be your superficial crural muscle. And then beneath that, if you were to cut the gastrocnemius, you would see the soleus muscle, which is your deeper muscle group. All three of these make up what's called, well, the gastrocnemius and the soleus make up what's called the triceps surae, which is the two muscles that insert on the calcaneus or Achilles tendon, which is the strongest tendon in the body. So looking at this on a model, you have the two heads of the gastrocnemius, which make the butt of the calf. And if you were to cut through those, you would see the soleus muscle of the back of the calf. The soleus muscle is a much more endurance muscle. That's what gets sore when you go for a long run. The gastrocnemius muscle is used more for sprinting and jumping and fast, explosive movements. Both of those attach to the calcaneal or calcaneal tendon, which is what that is showing here. The last thing I want to talk about with this lab is just the muscle types, the three muscle types, and looking at them under the microscope. We've gone over this in both the histology lab, the histology lecture, and also the muscle lecture, but I will quickly review it again for this lab. So the skeletal muscle is striated. It's made up of sarcomeres and myofibrils. It is multinucleate, and it has the ability to provide fast contraction as well as voluntary contraction. Smooth muscle has a single central nucleus and is fusiform or football in shaped. It provides slow, powerful contractions and is involuntary. Lastly, cardiac is striated but involuntary. It has a single nucleus and the cells are branching. It also possesses intercalated discs, which are made up of gap junctions and allow for a quick stimulus signal to be passed from one cell to the next so that the heart muscle can contract in unison. So looking at the skeletal muscle is voluntary. It's striated and it's typically attached to one or more bones. The striations are alternating light and dark transverse bands. This results from those overlapping thick and thin myofilaments. So you can see the bands here that are perpendicular to the cylindrical shaped cell. Skeletal muscle is voluntary and it is made up of muscle cells. Other words for muscle cells include muscle fibers or myofibrils, and they can be as long as 2 or 3 feet really. Cardiac muscle is limited to the heart, and that's where it pumps blood. It is striated, so you can kind of see the perpendicular striations here as well, but this is an involuntary muscle. Cardiac muscle is special because it must be able to contract with regular rhythm. The muscle cells of each chamber have to contract in unison, and the contractions have to last long enough to expel blood. It also must be really resistant to fatigue. It would be very bad news bears if your heart got tired all of a sudden. And lastly, the cardiac muscle needs to be able to work whether you're sleeping or unconscious or in a coma. Looking at your cardiac muscle, it has one nucleus, and it is branching. You can see the branching here, you can see the branching here. And it also has specialized structures, these intercalated discs, which are gap junctions allowing for the quick signal sending from one cell to the next. As I mentioned previously, cardiac muscle cells are striated, but the overall cardiac cells are shorter and thicker. They don't run the full length of the muscle like skeletal muscle cells do. Each myocyte is joined to several others at uneven linkages called the intercalated discs. They appear as dark, thick lines in tissue sections, and these are those gap junctions. There are also serve as mechanical junctions that keep the myocytes from pulling apart. In cardiac muscle, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is less developed, but the T-tubules are larger and admit additional calcium from the extracellular fluid, which allows them to stimulate muscle tissue more easily. Cardiac muscle, when it is damaged, repairs by fibrosis. This is why heart attacks are so bad, because with a lack of oxygen to the tissue, cardiac muscle dies pretty quickly. And so when it dies quickly, it doesn't repair itself as well as other tissues might. So you'll have some repair, but typically what you have is cardiac muscle scar tissue instead of functional cardiac muscle. And so your heart will never be the way that it was before that tissue was damaged. Cardiac muscle is special because it can contract without nervous stimulation. The autonomic nervous system can increase or decrease your heart rate, but it can still contract and pump blood even without the autonomic nervous system. Cardiac muscle has very slow twitches, so it can maintain tension for almost a quarter of a second, and this gives the heart the time to push blood out of it all over your body. Cardiac muscle uses aerobic respiration almost exclusively, so it's very rich in myoglobin and glycogen, and it has especially large mitochondria in it. This is what also makes cardiac muscle super vulnerable to interruptions of oxygen supply. So if you drowned or you have a heart attack where oxygenated blood is not getting to your cardiac muscle, it's highly vulnerable to damage once the oxygen supply is cut off. Lastly, the cardiac muscle is very fatigue resistant. Again, it would be bad if your heart got tired and could no longer contract. Smooth muscle is composed of muscle cells that have a fusiform shape. There's only one nucleus. It's located in the middle of the cell, and it has no visible striations. That's why it gets its name smooth. It still has thick and thin myofilaments, but they're not aligned with each other and they're not organized the same way. Z-discs are absent in smooth muscle and they are replaced by something called dense bodies. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is scanty. There are no T-tubules. And smooth muscle receives nervous system stimulation through autonomic fibers, not somatic motor fibers. Smooth muscle is typically found around hollow organs. You have them in different layers. So in the case of the stomach here, you have a circular layer of smooth muscle, which is wrapped around the muscle like a necklace per se. And then you have a longitudinal layer. So the smooth muscle wraps around the hollow organ. The circular layer of the smooth muscle wraps around like this, and then the longitudinal layer wraps around the muscle or the hollow organ like this. And this allows for the ultimate squishing around of hollow organs to allow for lots of digestion aid. So you can picture it like being able to squish a stress ball or one of those squishy ball toys that you can find in like the dollar section of Target. It allows it to squish around, which is moving everything inside that hollow organ all around and aid in digestion. Smooth muscle is involuntary. It can contract without nervous stimulation. It can contract in response to other stimuli. So chemical stimuli, it can respond to stretch. When food goes down your esophagus, it stretches the esophagus out. And so you can have smooth muscle contraction responding to that stretch. Some muscles in the stomach and intestine have pacemaker cells that just set off waves of contraction through the entire layer of muscle. You can find that in the colon as well. Most smooth muscle is innervated by the autonomic nerve fibers. You've got, remember, from the autonomic nervous system, you have fight and flight, which relaxes the smooth muscles of the digestive system and slows down digestion. And then you've got rest and digest, which increases the smooth muscles of the digestive system.